Uno, tres.
Vamos a cocinarla aquí en el fogón.
Hace su ingreso el señor José Manuel Salazar Cirinach, secretario ejecutivo de la Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe de las Naciones Unidas.
Good morning, the director of ECLAC, accompanied with the research director of the School of Government Lavatnik in Oxford University.
Saludamos a quienes nos acompañan.
We would like to greet those that are present in the Raúl Plevich room today at ECLAC and those joining us virtually. We would like to especially welcome the authorities of the government of Chile, the ambassadors of member countries of ECLAC and members of the UN, representatives of international organizations, colleagues of agencies, funds and programs of the UN, representatives of civil society, the entrepreneurial world, and colleagues. In 1948, thanks to the conference, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean was created. 75 years later, we are holding a series of conferences that will be lasting until today. This has taken place throughout 9 months to celebrate the 75th anniversary of ECLAC. We are joined by Lant Pritchett from Oxford University, and he will be talking about educational policies for a transformative world. I'd like to offer the floor to José Manuel Cirinach, Executive Secretary of ECLAC.
Muy buenos días a todos y todas las personas presentes.
Good morning, all those of you present and virtually joining us. I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to this 9th and last Keynote conference to celebrate the 75th anniversary of ECLAC. And most especially, I'd like to greet the authorities of the government of Chile, representatives of the diplomatic corps, officials of the UN system, colleagues of ECLAC. Dearest friends, I'd like to share with you that these 9 months we've had the privilege of counting on a series of conferences, apart from the traditional Pritchett conference, to celebrate the 75th anniversary. This cycle has been made up of 9 conferences that have varied in their process, such as globalization and the implications for the region, offered by Arantxa González, the necessary reforms in financial architecture, which was addressed by José Antonio Ocampo, and the challenges of funding other policies on climate change, which was discussed by Aloisio Mercadante. We also addressed the challenges for growth in the region, the new visions on economic complexity for economic and productive development by Ricardo Hausmann, the links of policies and productive development in social protection by Santiago Levy, Adela Cortinas, and the future of democracy and the era of artificial intelligence by Daniel Inminerarity. A crucial aspect of the conferences and topics selected is that our objective has been to celebrate our anniversary and with it all of ECLAC's contributions in the past, but looking to the future, especially to look at how to advance towards a more sustainable future. That is the slogan of our 75th anniversary. We have the spirit. We bring new ideas for critical and innovative ideas and to better inform our work and to offer us tools and relevance to the work we do for the next years, the coming years. And we will be facing challenges, novel and different challenges. For example, many are showing us that these clashes are normal, and others are finding new ways of describing the economies and poly-globalization. And the human development of the UNDP also, through its report, speaks to us about the political tendency towards populism and how to fight this associated polarization. These are some of our new challenges. And I'd like to say that in this anniversary, we are publishing towards the end of March a new special number of ECLAC's magazine to rethink the challenges of the region through the decalogue of these challenges, which lead us to a way of identifying how we will be addressing these in the region, and but also reflecting on how to do this. I'd like to invite you to read the new number that is about to be published. I am pleased to say that we will be closing proudly this cycle with the conference of one of the most renowned specialists in economic and social development, which is what our home does, Professor Lant Pritchett. Lant has a very particular profile in this community in economic development. He studied at the universities of Brigham Young, where he obtained his degree in economics, the Mass MIT, and here he obtained a doctor's degree, and he is a visiting professor also in Oxford and Harvard, at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has also had a high position at the World Bank for a series of years. This brief description could lead us to think that he is a conventional economist, a representative of this main current that ECLAC has always worked on. But if we wanted to think of Lant as an orthodox economist, we would paradoxically have to qualify him as one of the most heterodox orthodox economists, because if anything has characterized his career is a critical perspective on his own work, on that of the institutions he's been associated with, and with respect to conventional wisdom, which we are sometimes tempted to simply accept without questioning. I would like to cite just two examples: his critical analysis of what was for many years one of the World Bank's flagship publications, Doing Business, published in 2011, when the prestige of that publication was almost undisputed, and in any case, undisputed, and his contributions to the publication, Economic Growth in the 90s, Learning from a Decade of Reform, published in 2024. Lant has never steered away from this path, as evidenced by his devastating critique of the analysis of the determinants of economic growth using regression analysis, published in 2002, or the title of his article of August last year, entitled Relying on Rigorous Evidence is Bad Advice. Providentially, much of Professor Pritchett's work is directly relevant to our work, which is organized around the 10 gaps of development and the challenges of governance and technical, operational, political, institutional capacity building in the public sector. I'd like to begin this second topic, which has occupied Lant and some of his colleagues at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University for years, where he served as Director of Public Capacity Building at the Harvard Center for International Development. Here, he developed the problem-driven iterative adaptation method, problem-driven iterative adaptation method, which, by the way, could have been an easier name. It is a very useful approach, which we should all study and learn in detail. Here at ECLAC, one of the questions we have ahead of us is whether his online course is still available. Economic growth, and specifically the political dynamics of economic growth, public capacity building, education, and poverty reduction, are central themes in Professor Lant Pritchett's very rich intellectual output. Without further ado, I'd like to leave you with the economist who knows better than anyone else the fecundity of a profound questioning of conventional knowledge and orthodoxies, but with an unexceptionable academic rigor and of conceiving economics as a tool to solve problems and not as a solipsistic exercise of contemplation and deductive reasoning disconnected from the world. We have not necessarily had a close relationship with him until now, and we hope to repair that, but he truly represents the aspirations and objectives that have guided the work of our house. Professor Pritchett, you have the floor.
Voy a hablar en inglés porque puedo hablar español, pero
I will be speaking English. I can speak Spanish, but I learned it 45 years ago in Argentina, therefore. So I won't be speaking English.
translation. I appreciate the introduction. I have found that there are pluses and minuses to being someone who challenges the orthodoxy and being provocative. I get invited to speak many places once. But for some reason, I'm very rarely invited back. So I hope that is not one of those occasions. So I was assigned the topic, when does growth, how does education support economic growth, when and where? Which might, in some sense, seem as an odd question, because it might be obvious or seemingly obvious that education is important everywhere and always. So I want to channel that into the sort of ECLAC, both history and vision. It's the 75th anniversary. So I want to sort of start from what everybody knew. What did everybody know 75 years ago? What has happened since? And hence, what do we know now that we didn't know then? And I want to give a sort of flow chart of the overall presentation, which is that we want to start from sort of what everybody knew was that education was a central part of the development process, and expanding to universal primary and universal basic education was going to be absolutely important. Now, the beauty of it is that did happen. Unlike many things that you might have thought were consensus and promoted and everybody agreed, there was, in fact, a massive expansion in schooling. It's one of the transformative, it's a transformative feature that happened in the late 20th century of human history, was that we really did succeed globally, and especially in Latin America, or equally in Latin America, to get every kid in schooling. Now, the consequence of that, though, is that although countries managed to acquire a lot more schooling, and that schooling was a lot more homogeneous across countries than we would have anticipated, what we know is that lots of countries didn't grow. So if you thought you were going to expand schooling and that necessarily everywhere and always was going to drive growth, you've come up against the fact that we tried it. We've run the experiment. We've done that. We have expanded schooling, and it hasn't, in fact, universally led to higher productivity in terms of output per worker, which means we have to confront the question, why not? What is it about the set of beliefs that we would have had in 1950 turned out to be wrong? And I'm going to focus on one of those. And the one I'm going to focus on is that there was this elision made in which two words became synonymous that really weren't synonymous enough. The words that became synonymous was we started believing in the importance of education, and that alighted into the importance of schooling on the premise that schooling adequately conveyed education. So what has happened is the differential extent to which schooling has transferred into actual education, the acquisition of skills, competencies, knowledge, dispositions, is the weak link in that chain. So what we have found is that in many countries we had much less production of education from schooling than we would have anticipated, and much less in some countries than others, and hence we have reaped less return. We shouldn't have expected that schooling alone, without it being productive of learning, would have produced growth, which leads to, and now we're to the full circle of what does the future look like? And if in the future we want schooling to produce more education in order to sustain the kind of productive, inclusive, and sustainable growth that ECLAC is looking towards in the future, we need to really rethink the way the schooling system works. Incremental, we've been at it for more than 100 years, the process of educating children. And if we're not where we want to be now, we can't expect business as usual to produce a very different outcome. They say crazy is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes. So we can't be crazy about schooling and just imagine that we have reached and are stagnant at these levels of learning of children, and that some modest amount of increase in spending or some modest incrementalist reforms are going to lead. So I want to talk ultimately about 5 things that, 5 ways in which from our 8-year research project at Oxford, we think systems need to change in order to produce better outcomes. So let me just start with the conventional wisdom of 1948, which was education was a human right. Everybody believed this. I say this because periodically people claim they've discovered a new role for human capital in the economic development process, but that's nonsense. Everyone has always believed that education was an integral and important part. It was declared as a human right at the same time that ECLAC was formed. And I went back and reread some of my W. Arthur Lewis, the great Afro-Caribbean economist, about economic growth. And in 1955, he asserts that as of 50 years before the turn of the 20th century, nationalist governments were already committed to expansion of the education and universality and literacy at all costs. So the idea that education needed to be universal, it's not a new idea. It hasn't been a new idea for 100 years. And again, unlike some things that might seem like idealistic commitments of the UN but don't come true, this one came true. So I have 2 graphs showing the distribution of education in 1950, roughly the period when ECLAC was formed, in Latin America versus the developed world, and today. And what you see is that across Latin America, there's been this massive increase in the years of schooling of an average youth. So I focus on youth 25 to 34 because those are sort of the recent entrants into the labor force. And in Latin America today, nearly every country has way more schooled population than the developed countries had in 1950. So a fact that I find consistently shocking is that Haiti, the least schooled country in all of LAC, actually youth have more years of schooling than youth in France did in 1950. In 1950, France considered itself a very developed country, and was, Americans and French don't always see eye to eye, but I think we agree. They were a classic civilization. They were a developed country. They were a world power in 1950, with only 4.9 years of schooling as the average schooling of their population, which is far surpassed by every Latin American country today. But what has happened is that The good news is, if we look at the relationship between GDP per capita and the amount of schooling a country has, that's upward sloping. Richer countries tend to have more years of schooling, but it's also shifted upward over time, which means at any given level of GDP, countries tend to have a lot more schooling. So a country that has not changed its GDP at all since 1960 actually has 3 more years of schooling than it used to, which is kind of the good news because, well, even countries that were poor and stagnant managed to expand the schooling of their labor force. The bad news is it means the exact same flip side of that relationship is that in 1960, the typical country with 6 years of schooling had a GDP of 10,000. And now they have the typical country with 6 years of schooling has much lower output per worker. So in some sense, there's been a lot of accumulation of education, but productivity of that has not kept up. So if you think about it, what was able to be produced in 1960 with 6 years of education was much more than what is produced with that same level of schooling today. And naturally, countries followed very different trajectories. So if you look at the bottom right, I show the trajectory of Thailand. And all these trajectories, the north-south direction is expansion of schooling, the east-west direction is the expansion of GDP per capita. All of the countries had massive expansions in schooling. Thailand had nearly identical expansion in schooling to Mexico, but Thailand had a quadrupling of GDP per capita, whereas Mexico grew much slower. And Venezuela grew in its schooling of the population even more than both of those, and yet has lower GDP per capita today than either of them. So, or has had much, much slower growth. Let me not confuse levels. And so the fact we now know, and couldn't have known in advance, is that the percentage rate of growth of schooling of your workforce and the percent of rates of growth of the output of your workforce, GDP per capita, are completely, totally uncorrelated. And again, this is the polar opposite of the belief that schooling everywhere and always would be essential and a driver of growth. It just isn't the case. And the consequence, one way of illustrating the consequence of the fact that the scatter plot is this cloud as opposed to aligning upon a strong association, is that if we compare, what people often do is they point to the highly successful countries who've been successful in having rapid growth, like Korea and Taiwan and et cetera, and they say, look, they had very high growth in schooling, and therefore countries with rapid growth have rapid growth in schooling, which is true. Unfortunately, it's also true that countries that had equally rapid percentage growth in schooling didn't have rapid growth. And so those bar charts show that if we take the rate of growth of schooling of the high-performing countries, it's lower than the average growth of schooling in LAC. So nothing about the growth of LAC can be explained by the fact that LAC was a laggard in expanding schooling. It just wasn't. And the expansion of school per se isn't what differentiates the countries. I'm wondering about time. It says it's 10:30 at night here on the podium. Okay, great. Okay. So which is why the title. The title has to be, where did schooling growth drive economic growth? Because it can't be everywhere. It just wasn't everywhere. Correlations don't necessarily imply causation either way, but on the other hand, correlations are just a fact. Just as a fact about the world, countries that had rapid schooling growth were no more likely to grow fast in output per worker than countries that didn't. And in part, that's because the expansion of schooling was so universal compared to the experience of growth. Much more heterogeneity in growth. So I think there are two huge, deep answers to this, of which I'm really only going to talk about one. And the one I want to talk about is, again, if we go back and think, what did people mean in the UN Charter when they said every child is entitled to an education? They actually meant outcomes. They meant every child is entitled to have the skills, competencies, beliefs, norms that it takes to be a successful adult in their economy. And in their economy, their society, their community, and that education was what was a universal right, because you had a universal right to be an included and productive member of your own society, and that required formal education in the modern world, and that was the commitment. Now, if we think of, if you think of the learning profile, which is, let's just track on one axis schooling, how much you've been to school. And then on the other axis, we track learning. How have your skills or competencies augmented by being in a year of schooling? If that relationship is steep and tight, then schooling is education. You can count on that if you're schooled, you are also educated. If, on the other hand, that relationship is weak and heterogeneous, meaning some kids are going through school and learning nothing, some kids are going through schooling and learning a lot, and on average not much is being learned, then we break the synonym. We have to stop talking about schooling and education as if they were the same thing. And moreover, if you then think of, I've illustrated 3 different types of countries in terms of their learning profiles. The blue, you see I'm trying to draw with narrow variance and high pace of learning. The yellow is sort of differential, moderate pace of learning with inequality in learning, and the lowest, the red, is sort of very little learning going on, but with heterogeneity. If we then look at a cross-section across countries, a year of schooling doesn't mean anything. If we say, oh, in Zambia they have 6 years of schooling, and in Argentina they have 6 years of schooling, and in Vietnam they have 6 years of schooling, that doesn't mean anything in terms of its actual description of what that person, the skills, competencies they command. So this is what has happened in the world, which is countries have pushed, and therefore if we measure competencies at age 15 across countries, we're going to find that even children who have all been to schooling and have 10 years of schooling are going to have radically different skill sets, which is indeed what we find. Okay. So a very recent paper by 3 authors, Gust, Hanushek, and Wozeman, measured the fraction of 15-year-olds that aren't achieving in mathematics and science a minimum level of skills. And the minimum level of skills roughly corresponds to the definition of the UN Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is that every youth should have an adequate education. And what they find is that in Latin America, which is highlighted, 61% only, I think, I can't really see those numbers. I should have worn glasses or something. Only 61% of youth who are in school, 61% of kids who are in school are not reaching the minimal standard. So most children who have made it all the way from grade 1 to grade 5 to grade 2 being still enrolled in secondary school are not reaching a minimal standard, and that's better than super low performing regions like sub-Saharan Africa, but it's much worse than other regions in the world like the OECD. And what this means is, and it's important because only 21% of youth are not in secondary school. But that means that even if you manage to get every child not in school, at the learning level of those that are now in school, it would only go up to 65%. 65%. Anyway, you wouldn't get that much gain because those who weren't in school, being in school, they would still be the majority of them not reaching minimal skills. So, yeah, oh, thanks. Yeah, I had these right, but this isn't my paper, so I don't. So the kind of the challenge is that the challenge is that the distribution of learning in LAC is far from where it could or should be in order for the expansion of schooling to lead to the education of the population that is needed to sustain growth. And so I just want to, and recent findings are, one time one of the provocative papers I wrote in 2020, or in 2000, was called "Where Has All the Education Gone?" And it just pointed out the fact that there are lots of places that had a lot of education, and it's just uncorrelated. At the time, we didn't really have good cross-national comparisons of learning. Now that we have two different, quite complete sets of comparisons of learning, we can see that if you run a horse race and ask the data, what leads countries to have growth, 0% of it is schooling, and all of it is the magnitude of learning while in school. If you just ask the data, which of these two factors is more explanatory or more highly correlated with economic growth, it's not, it's not just that it's mostly, but it's nearly all learning. And just a simple exercise that I did with the latest World Bank data on harmonized test scores is I ask the data to interact these two variables and say, how much does a year of schooling matter depending on how much education you got while in school? And so if you look at the bottom left corner, it shows this interactive effect and says if we add a year of schooling to your economy, how much would it be expected to add to your GDP? And at Dominican Republic's level of learning, which is one of the lowest in Latin America, the answer is 0. The answer is adding youth with these levels of measured learning is not going to contribute to growth. If you ask at the LAC average, it's substantial, but not huge. And if you compare that to how much would adding an additional youth at the level of learning that's observed in current Vietnam, which is a much poorer place than most of Latin America, or has been, it's a much higher contribution. And again, this makes a ton of sense, right? This is it's surprising a bit that it's taken us long enough to come up with this kind of clear and compelling way of telling the story, because if you say, how much would I expect to add to output from adding any kind of capital, depends on the quality of the capital. If I add a very low productivity tractor, I'm going to have less contribution to my agriculture output than a very sophisticated and capable tractor. So then if you look up in the Northeast, it just sort of shows that no matter two completely different sort of empirical exercises, both produce the result that adding to if Latin America added 20 points to these kind of scores that are scaled on a measure of 500, they would be expected to be at 4,000 higher GDP per capita than they are today. And again, the 20 points is about what LAC seems to be behind countries that have its GDP. So if Latin America were only producing the learning outcomes that other similarly situated countries were producing, they would be expected to have much larger output. And these are two completely different empirical exercises that both give quite similar magnitudes, and they're huge. So the potential gain from learning is huge. The potential gain from schooling is quite limited. Because, again, if you add more of sort of unproductive capital, it's not going to transform the productivity. If you transform the productivity of every person with schooling coming into the labor force, you can have transformational effects on the capability of the labor force. So now, just because I'm an economist, and having been an economist a long time, I'm slightly defensive. I'm not emphasizing learning exclusively because it would contribute to GDP. There's lots of other reasons to get an education, and there are lots of benefits to education that aren't directly monetary. So I did an exercise with a co-author where we looked at, we had data both on whether women had been to primary schooling, but also whether they could read. And we asked ourselves, how much more impact does it have on child mortality if the woman not only went to school but can read? How much difference does it have on women's empowerment if she not only went to school but could read? How much difference does it have on their sophisticated use of financial instruments if not only did they go to school, they could read? And the benefits are at least twice as large from having both gone to school and reading. So again, I'm not instrumentally justifying education exclusively in terms of its contribution to GDP. The real concrete output that matter for people's livelihoods and life outcomes are going to be better if, in addition to going to school, the more they learn in school, because it's more of what we wanted in the first place. Okay, so upshot of the narrative so far is that we really should be focused in the education. We should refocus education on education, which sounds stupid, but but it's not at all, because schooling systems became focused on schooling, and they really, to a large extent, became bureaucracies driven by quantitative targets that did not directly incorporate and inculcate a commitment to true education. And so the gains, and to a large extent, that was a not unreasonable pattern, in the sense that if you would have said in 1960s, let's focus on the quality of schooling, not the quantity, you would have been wrong, because people weren't in school. And improving the quality of schooling for those few that were in school at the expense of putting more kids in school wouldn't have been the right priority. And so for a very long time, education systems said, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, which is not a terrible strategy, but we're at that bridge. There's no more gain to be had in Latin America from pure quantity expansion. And yet we have education systems whose fundamentally DNA is still quantity driven. And so that is what requires change. So I'm going to, I have 3 points that the slide says perhaps we'll skip. Turns out we will. I'm going to skip these and maybe come back to them. But I want to, because I want to get to, and I don't want to go too much. How much? Really? But it all goes till 11:30. No, it all goes to 12:30. Okay, but I don't want to take away from questions. Okay, good. Okay, so then let me skip anyway. No. Let me come back and say one of the 3 points. Right? One of the 3 points is that I've just given you data about scores and where Latin America compares on scores, and I think it's easy to be skeptical that what does a PISA score of 500 mean anyway? And moreover, when I do these empirical exercises linking math scores to economic growth, many of you are like saying, "What's so important about math? I never use math anyway." Why are you focused on these cognitive skills? And I want to emphasize that what these scores are measuring, and the reason they're so low, is that even though a score on an assessment is a single number in a given field, it's often measuring something much deeper than that. Because even though area is a single number. It's a two-dimensional concept, right? Area of a plane, it's length times height, right? Which means there's two dimensions to it, and they multiply them together and you can talk about the area, but the area can take many different shapes. So one of the things is when we think about how much a person knows, there's two dimensions to their knowledge. One is its depth. You know, some things we know just by rote memory, some things we know and we can kind of understand them in novel situations. Some of the things we can actually explain and teach to others. Some things we know so well, we can use them and apply the principles of them in novel situations. So on the horizontal axis is kind of depth of knowledge. And on the vertical axis is coverage, right? It's sort of how much within that domain do you know? So in mathematics, this would be different domains of mathematics, but there's also the sense of which, okay, you know arithmetic. Do you know arithmetic well enough that if you're presented a non-standard problem, you can apply the correct principles of arithmetic to come to a solution? And really, the reason that test scores are so low is that the existing school systems have by and large emphasized coverage over understanding. And so when you give students an assessment that tests or assesses the depth of their knowledge, you realize that although they graduated from a school in which they took a course in algebra and did the homework and passed that course in algebra, they had no idea how to take that and apply it to any situation other than doing their algebra homework. So this red sort of shading is, I've covered lots of things in school, but I didn't learn, other than the basics, I didn't learn them deeply enough to really use them. So what that leads to is two things. One, this is an actual learning profile of the performance of Indonesian students as they went through school, assessing their competence over grade school, and I'm using Indonesia because we have the data from Indonesia, and this data is very rare to come by, but Indonesia is at exactly the Latin American mean of performance on the standardized exams. If you look at their performance over grade school arithmetic, it peaks at grade 6. And then the remaining 6 years, you don't make any progress in arithmetic, even though you really didn't have very much command of arithmetic. And the reason is because most of the kids who didn't learn arithmetic early missed key principles about arithmetic, and hence they had no foundation to build on. So you could be exposed to more and more topic coverage. And so one of the things we saw is that only a tiny fraction of Indonesian high school graduates could add 2 fractions. Like, just add 2 fractions. And if you push back, it's because they never really understood fractions. You know, so they actually didn't learn really what a fraction represented and how it worked in grade 4, which meant once they got introduced to more and more sophisticated things, they couldn't do that. Which meant if you attempted to build on the assumption that they knew how to add fractions, you couldn't build anything else because the foundation wasn't there. I say this because I think what workers in the 21st century need is the ability to apply known principles to novel situations. Innovation means novation, new things. And so if you have built a body of students who have emerged from high school without the ability to actually understand at the conceptual level what they've learned, it's much worse than you think. So the fact that they can't perform on the PISA into the application of arithmetic and mathematics into concrete problems means even though you have taught them 10 years of mathematics courses, they haven't actually learned anything that they can usefully apply to their current knowledge. Okay, that's one point I wanted to make, and let me Now, so then if you ask, what should we do? What's the future look like? How do we fix this problem? I think there are, we should expect this challenge to be very, very hard. And the reason we should expect this challenge to be very, very hard is most countries have made very little progress on it in the last 20 or 30 years. So amazingly, given how much the world has changed in so many ways, most OECD countries are at exactly the learning levels they were 30 or 40 years ago. So 17-year-olds are not emerging from the school experience any more equipped for the modern world than I was. And I went to a public school in Boise, Idaho, so I did not emerge from high school with a tremendously depth of knowledge, and it's gotten no better. And second, the fact that you are where you are suggests that the politics of schooling is enormously more attractive and easy than the politics of learning. Right? We look around the world. If you see that every country has expanded schooling and very few countries have adequate learning, the conclusion must be the ability to correct a political consensus to build schools out and hire more teachers and put more kids in school must be really, really powerful because it happens nearly everywhere. Whereas correctly constructing a politics of learning is very hard. And again, it's just like you just look at the world and say, if we haven't made much progress on it, even though we've tried to, and it's quite rare to have success, the unfortunate conclusion is it's going to be hard. So anyone who tells you that fixing your education system is going to be easy, we'll just adopt some AI, or we'll just throw some technology at it, or we'll do this minor incremental tweak, it doesn't even make common sense. It doesn't pass the smell test of, could that really be true? Because if it were easy, it would have been done. And if it were easy, more people would do it. So you should expect it to be hard. And a recent McKinsey study that came out just last month sort of emphasizes that many, many countries have had education reform efforts, and very few of them have been successful. And they can list lots of reasons why they've failed to be successful. Including, I love the language, organ rejection of the reform. If you transplant a foreign organ into a working body, it usually rejects it because your immune system says, that's not us, that's not me. And so the incrementalist approach often assumes you can take something that's worked elsewhere and plop it into this body, and it will there work in this body like it did in the other body. But that's not how organic organisms work. Organic organisms both have positive and negative features, and they reject things from the side. So let me tell you what I think the 5 actions are, and then I will stop and take questions. And I'm going to go over these very fast. So I think there's 5 things that it's going to take to reform education systems to put them on a path to accelerating learning. The first is you have to commit to universal early foundational learning. And every one of these adjectives is important, meaning the problem with kids not performing well in grade 10 has to be solved in grade 2. So if you look at those learning profiles, if they're too shallow early and kids aren't reading fluently by grade 4, you don't fix it with tutoring in grade 8 and 9. So there's a lot of attention to what do we do about adolescence. That attention is necessary and in some sense a necessary consequence of the existing failed systems. But if you want to improve the future, you have to improve the future now for the young. So universal, meaning every kid can learn these basics. Early, they need to master them early so that they can build on it. And foundational, and by foundational, I don't mean the 3 R's, I don't mean emphasize arithmetic. I mean procedural and conceptual mastery of a topic. They need to learn it so that they know it in the ways that they can apply it to new situations. If you can't apply it to a new situation, you don't know it well enough to move to the next step. So we have often in our curricula in schooling systems built very narrow towers. And the narrow tower often serve a filtering. It's like, we're just going to move ahead very fast, and if you drop out, well, then you weren't the kind of person who was meant to be educated. Whereas what we need to commit to is that every kid can master these fundamentals at not just a rote level or a procedural level, but at a conceptual level. Second, you need to measure learning in a way that's regular, reliable, and relevant. And I apologize for using the word relevantly, but we had to. Anyway, okay. So, and again, all of those aspects are important. You know, this is not saying test, test, test. This is the opposite of saying test, test, test. Because what many systems do is they have high stakes for the student tests. That's not the kind of measurement that helps systems get better. You want to measure learning in a regular way, so you know from period to period whether it's going forward, and you need to measure it for the child. You need to measure it reliably in ways that people who are doing the teaching understand what's being measured and trust that what's being measured is the important things they're trying to teach. And so we need construct validity of what's being measured in terms of its education, and it needs to be relevant. It needs to be able to be used by the people who need to make decisions. The third is we need to align systems around learning commitments. This is a deep and important thing, which is most education systems are incredibly fractured, and the way the large bureaucracies work is they work on the principle of procedural compliance, that if you get hired as a teacher, you are paid as a teacher, you have some nominal performance review that is completely detached from whatever goals have been declared from the system, and hence what's articulated as goals, what's measured, and what's rewarded are often completely incoherent. Anybody who's worked in a large bureaucracy has seen this, to where the leader proclaims these wonderful goals, but what you're actually working on and what you're actually rewarded for may have nothing to do with those. And so the existing schooling systems were aligned around expansion. They were aligned around growth, they were aligned around process compliance, but they were never really aligned around learning. And since they weren't aligned around learning, there was a huge mismatch between the nominally declared education goals and the actual practices going on. The fourth thing is that you need to support teaching. And again, all of these may seem like common sense, but none of these are common, because nearly all education systems or schooling systems in the world support teachers. And there's a radical difference between supporting teachers, those who happen to have the position and post of being paid as a teacher, and supporting teaching. Supporting that those people that are in the classroom as teachers are capable and supporting in providing to their students the learning opportunities they deserve. So it's a radically different thing to think, how am I going to design my system to support teaching? And what's easy is to support teachers and just assume that teachers are engaged in effective teaching, but they're not. And so many of the ways, the bureaucratic ways that systems work, is they have radically overestimated the extent to which the routine support of teachers is actually contributing to better teaching. And finally, you need to adapt what you adopt as you implement. So you can look around the world, you can see successful student systems in creating high learning outcomes. Singapore has a fantastically good outcomes. Finland has, strikingly good outcomes. But and at one point, a colleague of mine was recruited by the education minister in Finland because they were getting 150 foreign delegations a year that were coming to Finland because Finland had been outperforming and was identified as a high-performing system. But, once you go finish, you're finished, is my motto. Finland can do what Finland does because it's Finland, and they have adopted what they organically to become Finland. They do it in a Finnish way. But again, this is why I like the metaphor of organ rejection. If you say, Finns have a very strong heart, let's cut it out of their chest and put it into mine, everyone sees that that's ludicrous, but everyone attempts to adopt policies from other places that have been successful and then assume that you can implement those without adaptation. It just doesn't work. As part of the RISE study, we had a paradigm case where a large state of India had adopted a program that had been working well in Britain, of each school forming a school-specific performance plan based on a school-specific diagnostic, had all of the right principles rhetorically. They did it, they implemented it in India, and every school produced a performance plan. And nothing else. Nothing else about the school changed. So the adoption of the program meant the school said, okay, we have to write a school performance plan. They wrote a school performance plan. They were all available on the web. Every school actually had it. And so if you look at, and they did it in this modern randomized controlled trial way, if you look at the treatment schools, they all did the performance plan, and then nothing else about the school changed. Nothing about teaching, nothing about inputs, nothing about priorities, nothing, and obviously nothing about learning. When I saw my colleague present this research for the first time, the estimated impact of this program on learning that got spat out by the computer was 0.000. And it was like, I have to fiddle with this so it's not 0.000 because no one's going to believe it could be so exactly zero. But it was exactly zero. And the reason it was exactly zero is they attempted to adopt without adapt. So Latin America is going to find a way for Latin American schools to be successful in a Latin American way. And Colombia is going to do it in the Colombian way, and Chile has been trying and is going to do it in the Chilean way. So you should expect that you might be able to learn the principles of what you're trying to do, and you might be able to copy some features, but you need to expect that there will be an enormous amount of adaptation. So I have in the slides, which are available, lots of things that support with facts and other evidence those 5 principles, but I'm going to skip over those and stop there with saying we have run the experiment. Let me just summarize. We have run the experiment of schooling every child. If schooling every child were the solution, the problem would be solved. But in the interim of getting to schooling every child, we lost the vision of educating every child and built schooling-focused schooling systems. And the future has to be to build from where we are, of every child in school to every child in school and learning. And to do that is going to require not incrementalism or more of the same or business as usual, because business as usual will give you what you had in the past, but a transformation of the systems. And the transformation of systems is going to be based on implementing, I think, some principles of effective systems, both across schooling systems and across other systems, which is you have to commit to outcomes, you have to measure outcomes in a way that helps people responsible for outcomes do better. You need to align your system around agreed upon goals. You need to support the people who are responsible for implementing those goals with the tools they need to succeed. And you need, when you are borrowing ideas, you need to adapt those to your circumstances. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos al señor Pritchett. Quisiéramos recordar al público presente que tienen la oportunidad de hacer preguntas a través de la plataforma.
Thank you, Professor Pritchett. We would like to tell all those that are attending online that you can ask questions on the Slido platform. Please state your name before you ask a question.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Pritchett, for a very rich and very profound and challenging conference about the relationship with education and economic growth. I'm going to make the first two questions, so that gives time for people connected and people in the room perhaps to process everything that we've heard, which is quite a mouthful, as they say in English. Now, you started today telling us about one crucial shocking fact. As we all know, human capital is important to economic growth. We know that. You didn't say it's not important. It's very important. And this we know. But what we don't know, or knew with such precision now, is that the levels of schooling are uncorrelated with productivity growth or with levels of per capita income. And this is shocking because the conventional wisdom in Latin America and in the world is to look at the increasing schooling rates and celebrate the progress and the good record of improvement over the years in most countries. And somehow under the belief that we now find from your talk that is totally false, that this will somehow translate into higher per capita incomes. And it is challenging, and as you have very clearly explained, because to have the human capital that Latin American and Caribbean countries need, it is clear that it must go beyond and then enter into the whole learning outcomes. So we have to get into the factories, so to speak, the educational system factories, how it works internally, the institutions, and what's happening in there that is producing such bad quality products. Sorry to use that terrible language in here, because it's not products, it's human beings are not being educated as they should. In addition, you told us that the fraction of youth not reaching basic skills in Latin America is 65%, which is 20 points above the fraction for Central Asia. That's the fraction of youth not reaching basic skills, 20 points above the fraction for Central Asia, 35 points above the fraction for East Asia and the Pacific and Europe, and 41 points above the level for North America. So I think this is the picture of an immense educational failure and crisis. Now, you recommend a strategy with 5 priority actions, and that was very, very interesting. Commit to universal early foundational learning, measure, align, support teaching, not teachers, as you said, adapt to what you adopt. So thank you very much. I think that gives us a roadmap about what to do. But I would like to pick your knowledge and experience a bit more about the house. I mean, in a way, these questions are already house, but a bit more into the more, you were doing some comments, making some comments about that at the end. Because as we were in our previous conversation, one of the traps in which we see Latin America is a low quality institutional trap. And this includes educational systems. So what thoughts can you share with us based on international experience about how to improve the quality education systems? I mean, how do we make progress in these 5 lines that you made? As you said, and maybe this is an unfair question for you, because as you said very clearly, each country or region has to do it. We have to do it our Latin American way, and that needs a lot of contextual knowledge. But perhaps you can go a bit deeper in telling us how do we improve the quality of institutions. I mean, you hinted to a number of things. I mean, improve teaching, not teachers, when you have teachers in trade unions that, oppose and resist. So those are, I mean, just to put an example, I'm not blaming that, but this is one factor that in some cases we know is difficult to persuade. But, any hints additionally on this that you could give us?
Okay. Yeah, I think there are some hints, but one of the frustrating things is that there are so few success cases. So, you know, this recent, and I hesitate to quote McKinsey, but okay, because they're already overpaid. I don't need to do marketing for them. But McKinsey study sort of looks, you know, this we've attempted to do as part of RISE, and what they've attempted to do is let's find places that have succeeded and see what they did. And there's two problems with that. One is there are very few places that have succeeded, and in particular that have succeeded in going from low performing to high performing. So a lot of times we see high performing systems that for all the data we can see have been high performing, but we don't see transformations. The second is, and part of the RISE study, we did 7 country case studies in depth with the country research team, and one of the research teams was on Vietnam. Because Vietnam is just this amazing outlier. If you graph GDP and learning scores, you know, Vietnam, the 15-year-olds in Vietnam do better than kids in the United States, better than kids in the UK, better than the kids in France. It's amazing. And they do it with very little income, right? And so we did a whole kind of research endeavor on what the hell is it that Vietnam did. And we looked at the correlation of learning outcomes with lots of things. And we concluded it was none of those things that we could observe. You know, if you look at like spending, it's obviously not spending. If you look at training of teachers, it's not training of teachers because other countries have similarly trained teachers. If you know, no matter what the empirical correlates are of the standard types of bureaucracy would measure, it wasn't that. And, you know, I was the director of this research program and had my Vietnam team there telling me all the things it wasn't. And I said, okay, you know, the British taxpayers have funded this research program with $5 million to answer the question, what is it that Vietnam did? And I'm kind of embarrassed to say it's nothing we can observe when we don't know what it is. And one of the researchers said, Lant, they succeeded because they wanted to. And anything that, you know, and I said, can I really tell the British taxpayers that? And he said, you better, because it's the truth. You know, they just did better because they were driven by a desire to succeed. And unless and until you can create that desire to succeed, you shouldn't expect to succeed. So I think, you know, that's a hard message. It kind of sounds silly that they succeeded because they wanted to. On the other end, it's super deep. Because one of the things the education sector often reflects is precisely that education has so many different objectives that it's hard to really generate and sustain a commitment to success. But unless and until you, as a society, across a variety of different political factions, across a variety of different socioeconomic factions, can agree that one of the things we're going to do together as a society is reach universal early foundational learning, and we're going to have that drive to succeed, you can't do it. And that's the first answer. The second answer is as part of my work on state capability, I talk about the techniques of successful failure. You know, if you're a bureaucrat and you've been in charge of some impossible task, what do you do so that you get promoted anyway? Even though you didn't accomplish your objective. And I think two of the things that we talk about, which are common techniques of successful failure, are what we call isomorphic mimicry. You just look like successful systems. So if you want to be a successful minister of education, you go to Finland, you find some crazy thing they do in Finland, like they have a piano in every classroom, which they do, and then you say, oh, we're going to be like the Finns, we'll have a piano in every classroom, because that's global best practice. and you bring it home, and you're the leader of global best practice, and it's all camouflage. You know, it's like peacock. Peacock's just a moderately large chicken, but it looks huge when it fans its tail because it's, you know, pretending to be something it's not. So isomorphic mimicry is a real danger, right? And so one of the things that you have to do to succeed is you have to thwart isomorphism. We are not going to accept appearances. We're going to accept outcomes. And the second, and this is even harder for people to politically accept, is the second technique of successful fear we call premature load bearing, which is you build a rickety bridge that looks like a bridge, and then you drive a truck across it and the bridge collapses. So you get into a cycle of super overambitious targets without adequate implementation, which then you fail, and then you're starting over again. And so you always, you know, you get overambitious as to what you can actually attain. And so I think we need realistic ambition, not overambition. And this is super hard because most, you know, countries need to actually radically streamline their curriculum to be successful. They are not giving enough time on task to allow children to develop the conceptual mastery of the topic. They're rushing through topics. You've been exposed to algebra, you've been exposed to trigonometry, you've been exposed to calculus. But did you actually learn calculus? Can you apply the principles of calculus in a novel situation? I had one of the researchers in our project went to Swarthmore College from Pakistan, and one way he got into Swarthmore College is he was the math topper on the Pakistan math exam. And this is more for people who've done math, but it's a great story if you understand math. He got into his first semester of calculus at Swarthmore, and like in the second class, the teacher said, as we all know, the integral measures the area under the curve. Really? He had never heard that. He had memorized how to integrate a whole array of functions so that if you presented him any problem in calculus, he could give you a solution. But he had never understood the first principle of the tool of calculus. So, which means streamline the curriculum to provide way more depth, way less coverage. And if you tell people that, they said, oh, you want our kids to be stupid? Because, you know, other countries, they cover these topics. And it's like, no, I want your kids to actually understand what they've been taught, not just have them been taught it. And for that, you need way more time on task to develop the conceptual depth. So the second thing is this align and commitment and measurement has to come around a set of achievable, ambitious, but realistic and concrete targets that are going to acknowledge that we can't give everything to everyone in the education system. And it's a hard message, but until you swallow it, you know. It's like, you know, if you go to the doctor and he says, in order to cure your bacterial infection, you need to take this much penicillin, and you go, I'll take half that much penicillin. It's a really bad idea because you're going to make it worse because you're going to develop a penicillin-resistant strain of bacteria. So, you know, not implementing what you have set out to do well actually creates its own downsides.
Thank you. I think this is interesting. Appearance of success, camouflage, and overambitious targets that you don't have capacity to implement. I think we can relate to that. We see it in our region, in certain countries, yes. The other question I wanted and this relates, I'm going to follow that by reading because it's a cluster of questions around the same thing. It's a bit, if you want to put examples of education, yes, but it's a bit addressing your other work on PDIA and the fact that institutions matter, of course. But you have argued that it's not just that institutions matter, what matters is institutional performance, right? And I think that's a very important argument. And then the issue of how to go about improving institutional performance and how to measure. So we at ECLAC are starting to make a very systematic effort at looking at the house in terms of institutional weaknesses, on how to strengthen what we're calling the top capacities of institutions, top in the sense of technical, operative, political, and prospective, capacity to think about the future, to convene the political capacity to convene the key stakeholders, spaces of dialogue, which themselves are part of the capacity to transform the realities, because of course public policy alone and a good technocratic paper doesn't do the trick. You need to bring along. So it's the political issue of that. And you have written extensively about capability traps and how to escape capability traps, and about problem-driven iterative adaptation as a method of improving performance. So my question is, can you give us some examples of successful application of PDIA? And by successful, I don't mean marginal improvement, but game-changing improvements, hopefully transformational changes. And this relates to a question by two colleagues here. Andres Berninger, who asked, governments play a major role in the development process. However, there are capability shortfalls. How can Latin American and Caribbean countries' governments address this issue? What should be prioritized? And Marco Ginás also asks, we are emphasizing the need to escalate and improve lax countries' industrial policies to address stagnant productivity. How could PDIA be used to do this?
Okay.
That needs like another lecture, I think, right?
Yeah. Can we bring the slides back up?
Slides back up. I don't know if you can do that, but you have the slides.
No, but
No, you want to show, yeah.
I want to show them because this is one of the slides I skipped. So it's always nice when I skip the slide and then you ask a question that's best answered, because
it will be up in a moment. They're working on it. Yeah.
Because
Mike.
Sensible.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think when I ask about successful examples of PDAA, I think we want to admit that most of what we say about PDAA is inference from having observed examples. So what we tried to do is look at actual successes and see what they actually had done. And so I think the principles of PDAA, that you need to be problem-driven, that you need to be iterative, that you need feedback loops, all of those principles are inferential principles from having compared successes to failures. So then B, I think we can also generate hundreds and hundreds of examples of success of PDAA-like techniques at the organizational level. The hard thing comes in moving from organizational to systemic, because often successes happen when committed individuals implement, they have a commitment, they kind of construct a problem in a way that creates authorization to act and then are successful. I think the very hard question is, how do we move from PDAA as a organizational strategy to a systemic strategy, and go from the organizational politics to the more countrywide politics. And there, we have to admit it, it's just super hard. But most of the other approaches that have been tried are sure to fail. So when we argue in favor of PDIA, we can say, for sure, this is how you create incremental success. We also think it's a strategy of what we call strategic incrementalism, which is you can build these up into a dynamic that it changes. I think a good example is, he brought the slides up. I want to bring So a good country level example is what has happened in Indonesian local government. I worked in Indonesia in 1998 for the World Bank, and a very dynamic and innovative colleague of mine, Scott Guggenheim, started just a bank project. And just in the bank project, he instituted new mechanisms of community and local deliberation to make decisions. So, Indonesia had never been democratic since 1966. And so it had been very top down. So there was no mechanisms whereby communities at the local level could come together and make anything like actual decisions. And so he just introduced into this World Bank project that local communities could have deliberative meetings, and they could choose which project they would get an unblocked grant that would be fungible for that project, that they could use it however they wanted within this scope. And it started off as a bank project, but since it was building on organic instruments for deliberation that existed already in Indonesia, it all of a sudden put weight on those. Meaning they had always had these meetings, but they were pro forma because the top-down decision was what was going to matter anyway. So they said, we're going to put a little weight on this. Not the whole budget of the government, but this tiny little component of this budget is going to depend on your deliberations. You can make these decisions, and you can make these decisions in locally democratic ways. Now, within 5 years, the communities that had had this happen inside the World Bank project insisted to the government that this is the way they wanted all their decisions to happen. So all of a sudden, from the bottom up, they said, the way we do it in this project actually leads to decisions more aligned with our interests. It leads us to with more information about things. And by 10 years after the project, and I emphasize 10 years because 10 years is a blink of an eye in a government's life, right? By 10 years after it, the law was changed so that the principles that were started in this bank project became the law by which all local government was done. So it's kind of a scaled example, but it's a scaled example that also illustrates you have to have success at the local level. Successful policies grow out of successful practices, not vice versa. I think oftentimes we think the policy drives the outcome, but often the causality is exactly wrong. We drive outcomes to better outcomes, and then we embody those practices into policies. Whereas if we, try and change behavior from policies backwards, it doesn't necessarily work. Then I just want to say one thing about this, is this, one of the things about, one of the things I've been wrongest about in my life is that when I first started working on education, I was part of a World Bank report in 2004 called Making Services Work for the Poor, in which we emphasized accountability, that these systems really weren't accountable in a meaningful way. And over time, I have repented of many of the ways in which that was interpreted, and maybe in which I interpreted myself, because accountability got translated in two radically different ways. One was what I call accounting-based accountability, which lets, reduce what you're doing to bits and bytes and numbers and measurable things, and we'll manage from the top down better by having harder targets, more discipline, and drive, like I say, drive to performance through accounting-based accountability. And I think for deep and important human topics that require concern and care, it doesn't work, because you drain the life out of the organization by making it accounting driven. And now I realize that what I really meant to say was we have to have account-driven accountability. What's an account? An account is a story. It's a narrative that I tell myself and others I care about what I'm doing and why. So I think effective organizations are really driven by account-driven accountability. People care about the purpose of the organization. They act with concern and care to forward the goals of the organization. And so this little silly graph, it's like we've been trying to fix dysfunctional organizations from the outside in. We're going to set up a new IT system. We're going to set up a new accounting system. We're going to have cost effectiveness. We're going to have more legal procedures with human resources. We're going to have new policies. And organizations succeed from the inside out. Organizations that are purpose-driven can succeed. And so I love a metaphor. You know, you don't make Pinocchio into a real boy by adding more strings. Right? Pinocchio was a puppet. If your puppet is inadequately disarticulated, you can make him a slightly better puppet by adding more strings. But you don't build an education system by making teachers into better puppets. You build an education system by creating a system where teachers who are committed to the purpose of education are supported, rewarded, valued, and that's going to be an account-driven system. There's going to be large measures of the objectives that drive the purposes and reflect the purposes, but ultimately the narrow accounting-based accountability that so appeals to civil service bureaucracies isn't, you can't turn a dead thing into a live thing from the outside in. So I think, and I realize that's slightly ducking the hard question of more examples, but I think when we look at the examples, and this is the point I was making about Vietnam, when we look at the examples, I love this TOP. It's technical. We've way overemphasized the technical at the expense of the operational and the political. And the political is both inside and outside. You have to have, to go from a low functioning to a new functioning organization, you have to reformulate the account of the organization and the account of the organization and its purposes that people have embedded into how they tell the narrative of who they are. So in Indonesia, when we ask teachers who they are, they say they're civil servants. They don't say they're teachers. Because in their view of prestige and priority, again, coming out of 30 years of a dictatorship in which the government was top down, being part of the government was the important thing. So they didn't have a narrative of themselves and who they were doing that revolved around education. It revolved around, I'm a civil servant and I'm compliant with processes that were developed and given to me from the top. And with that narrative, you can't rebuild a more functional education system.
Thank you very much. I think this example of you cannot make Pinocchio a better puppet, but I am more. It's fantastic. It's really it says it all. I have two questions here from two other persons. Silvia Sarabia asks, besides focusing on early foundational learning, is there something to do regarding continued education programs, given ongoing demographic transition? And then perhaps another one by Javier Mancero. Please elaborate on measuring learning. There is a pushback to standardized testing, universities not requiring them for admission. Which tools can be used?
Okay. Unfortunately, to Sylvia, my answer is I don't know. I've never studied continuing education, so I just don't have anything to say. Sorry. It probably is important, probably because given the lags of the education system, you still have to do something about those that got the education they have. But since I haven't devoted any of my research or attention to it, I just don't have a good answer, and so I don't want to say anything stupid. So I will say nothing at all and avoid saying something stupid. On the other, I think when we say measure it reliably, regularly, and relevant, one of the main things we mean by that is much more attention to formative assessment and much less attention to high stakes for the student standardized testing. So, you know, I don't know if I avoided using the word testing. I use assessment because assessment is integral to the education process. If I don't know what you know and don't know, I can't really teach you effectively because I've got to start from where you are. And so one of the things I think has been radically underestimated is formative assessment, which is how are teachers know how are teachers gauging their own students' conceptual understanding, and how are teachers being empowered to recognize certain categories of mistakes that are common and fix those with new pedagogy. So I think, you know, when I say measure reliably, regularly, and relevant, I am not advocating radically more standardized testing, particularly that's high stakes for the student. I'm emphasizing that one of the really shocking things is that teachers often just don't know what their students do and do not understand, and teachers are often not prepared pedagogically to use practice work like homework in a way that's diagnostic. So, you know, when you go to add fractions, for instance, there are certain mistakes that are indicative of understanding and conceptual errors. And so the sophisticated pedagogy requires recognizing not just that you got the answer wrong, but that how you got the answer wrong represents some conceptual mistake. So I think formative assessment is just radically more important and has been radically underemphasized. And programs of effective pedagogy that kind of integrate the teaching, the formative assessment, and then the follow-on teaching to be responsive to that are just dramatically more important. You can improve student outcomes amazingly with roughly the same resources by embedding it into this cycle. So again, I just want to be, you know, the world of standardized testing is often dominated by a few very prominent monopolies. I have no interest in them making more profit. I am not saying more standardized testing. I am saying more measuring of the outcomes we want, which is going to not, you know, a lot of it isn't going to be standardized testing. It's going to be other ways of assessing student performance and making it relevant to the teaching process. Any additional assessment that isn't designed to feed back into the teaching is not where the highest returns are in my mind.
That answer gives me, you know, just a spontaneous question to you because, of course, this might be unfair. You are an economist after all, so I'm not necessarily, you know, a specialist in learning or education. But there is a discussion in Latin America and I think around the world about the involvement of parents in schools. I mean, is there any evidence on conclusion about, you know, whether you get better results or is easier to change and to improve performance in educational systems if you bring along the parents, or it's better to say parents stay home and let us manage this, even though it's your children? Any thoughts on that? I mean, you're allowed to say I don't really know what's
No. I think so. I think there's been an enormous, and again, you know, some of the rhetoric I was involved in earlier may have been responsible for this. There was an enormous kind of move towards creating greater accountability in school systems by bringing in, you know, like parent-teacher committees with more authority or school-based management committees. I think the school-based management committee as a mechanism of bringing parents into the schools in a way that improves schools doesn't work. So it was a mistake because I think in part because they were called school-based management committees, whereas parents never had the time and attention to effectively manage the schooling process. So that particular modality of parental, I think, was an outgrowth of the accountability movement, and I think by and large is not proven very productive. That said, having parents aware of and engaged in their student progress can be very, very helpful. So, some localities started, publishing in the newspaper, like, your child in 4th grade should be able to do this, in a way that even a modestly educated parent could say, hey, can you do this? And they would see where their child was. Because one of the biggest things, and I unfortunately, my research project didn't cover Latin American countries specifically, but one of the big problems in many systems is that they were built paradoxically both as expansion systems and filtering systems. So it was really, a lot of teachers in India have the idea that there are kids who belong in school and who are going to succeed in school and kids who don't, and nothing they do as a teacher can make any difference anyway. So my job is to teach the curriculum, and kids who can handle the curriculum, I've just identified an able kid, and then they get promoted, and then we have a high stakes test, and those are who we choose. And so it was really a selection system, which meant the teaching was often wildly at odds with what the students actually knew. So which meant if you got the parents involved, the beauty of a parent is they don't know any pedagogy, but they only have one student. So they can actually pay a lot of attention to where their child is and track the progress of their child. So I think getting parents involved in the education such that they know where their child is and what their child needs to do to progress can be super important if it's integrated into the ability of the teacher to respond to those learning deficits. Because one of the key problems in these enrollment expansion plus filtering systems is that children get left behind by 3rd grade. By 3rd grade, they're so hopelessly behind the curriculum that they're not learning anything in the classroom. And to fix that often requires direct parental engagement of, hey, my kid can't do this yet. Why can't, and what are we going to do about it? So I think that has been, and one of the most shocking things to emerge from all of the studies of COVID is that in a district of Indonesia that's very education focused due to history and culture, the kids actually learned more while the schools were closed than they would have learned had the schools been in operation for the lagging kids. So the kids that were ahead did worse when the schools closed. The kids who were way behind did better. Why? Parents only had one student, and they paid attention to that student's level. So the children that were being ignored by the system because they were behind and hence not of the type that could master this, actually they had absolutely more progress in the year schools were closed than in a typical school year. So parents can play a big role, but I think trying to structure that through school-based management committees and formal contestation at the school level just didn't work.
Thank you. So that was a very complete answer, by the way, and a lot of lights. The 2 last questions here from 2 colleagues here. Alberto Arenas, who is the head of division of social policy, by the way, here, updating of training in order to be more closely articulated with the opportunities and needs of the labor market. How can this lack of coordination be overcome? And maybe here I would add that, because we've been talking with Alberto, colleague, partly it's the education system, but then we haven't talked about the whole issue of professional training, education, and short courses and careers and all that really is close to the labor market. And the next one from Daniela Trucco, however accurate the differentiation between schooling and education, what about the 40% not concluding secondary education? and the inequality results. That's another dimension that, of course, a lot of the indicators in Latin America, I mean, the differentiated access, not just to schooling, but certainly to learning results is a major root cause of inequality. So maybe some thoughts about that.
So, I think that there's two disconnects, right, that are important. The first is that if you look, in an education system in which, and I'm going to use the kind of PISA 500 is the norm for the OECD, and, in the typical Latin American country is a PISA 400 is the average student. A PISA student with 400 isn't ready for any kind of vocational training, because any sophisticated basic training to be an electrician, to be a plumber, to be a carpenter is going to assume they actually have conceptual mastery over skills that they don't have, right? So, a 400 and below PISA student really isn't ready for vocational training. And so you have vocational training as the backup, having to be remedial for what the school system should have done. Now that has to be addressed in the short run, right? You have to address in the short run that, the idea that we could channel more, there is a very popular idea, because we have so many unemployed youth emerging from secondary schools, that if they had more vocational training opportunities, they'd better integrate the labor market. That's largely correct, because what's lacking in the we have the paradox of massive unemployment of youth with high levels of schooling, and employers saying, I can't find any qualified workers. But those two are perfectly compatible if the kids emerging from the school don't even have the basic levels of skill sets that would make them easily trainable as, craft workers. So I think we have to acknowledge that, and just more vocational per se, I don't think is the answer, because, one of the examples that I think is maybe in one of the slides I skipped is they do this question in India, where in India, you're taught measurement by being shown a picture of a ruler and a pencil or an object, and they always orient the object on 0. So if you ask kids how long something is, it's where the tip of the object is on the ruler. Then if you displace the object, so if it's 6 centimeters long and you started at 2 and the tip is at 8, 40% of kids in tertiary education in India say the object is 8 centimeters long. So they actually don't okay, let's say I'm going to train you to be a carpenter. You really haven't mastered on a conceptual and practical level the concept of measurement, right? So that you're I mean, this is what I mean by foundational learning, right? You have mastered the curriculum, and what the curriculum told you is length means where the tip of the object is on the ruler, and I have to say, one of the most heartbreaking things I've seen in my studies in education is they have this video of this child with an actual pencil and actual ruler, and they put the pencil, and it's 6 centimeters long, and then they move the pencil and ask the kid, how long is it now? And you can see the poor kid's brain go, I know things get longer because you move them. But I also know that what length means when I go to school is where the tip is. So he'll say 8 centimeters. And they moved it all the way to 12 centimeters. And he kept saying, and I say this video is so poignant because you can see him think, I know this isn't right. I know that, the length didn't change, but I also know, so I think my basic answer is we need to improve both the training part, but not the training part alone. The idea that we can solve the education problem with training overestimates the raw material that could come into training from existing secondary education. And so fixing that they have some conceptual foundational basics on which a professional kind of training could be built, I think is still essential. So I'm for more vocational, but and I'm for more vocational also because it means you're not conveying that the sole purpose of education is more education, and a university degree is the only legitimate entree into the labor market, which I think is a problem that's been compounded and made worse in many ways. The final answer.
40% inequality.
Yeah. I was going to turn to that. I'm going to say something. I don't know how many unpopular things have I said so far. I'm going to say something that's unpopular. Many of the kids who are dropping out of school because they're not learning anything. School's miserable. School is a miserable place to be if you're way behind and not learning anything. And so a lot of the dropout, particularly at the secondary level, is kids who have been told by the schooling system that they're a failure, kids that know from their own experience they're not actually learning anything, and they drop out. Forcing those kids to stay in school seems cruel to me. Like, I'm going to, conditional caste transfers, which are very popular, they seem cruel to me. You're a 14-year-old, 15-year-old kid. You've gone to crappy schools where they haven't discharged their responsibility to teach you well. You're way behind. You can't read at grade level. You can't perform at grade level. You're being told you're a failure. So you decide to drop out. And they come and say, unless you go back to school, we're going to take your mother's social protection away. That's obscene. That's blaming the victim and forcing him back into school so your enrollment statistics look good by taking money away from the mother. That's not right, right? So I think the answer to a lot of dropout is fix the schools, right? You can't just force kids back into school on the premise that they will go back to school and learn stuff. So when we actually tracked learning of kids in Indonesia with a survey that allowed us to actually measure for the particular kid how much more they knew, the kids that were behind knew it didn't matter whether they stayed in school or not for what they actually learned in the long run. So I'm all for that every kid should finish secondary school, but I'm not necessarily all for the solutions, the assumption that we can just force kids back into the same school and that will be success. Because I don't know that we will fix the underlying lifetime inequality of having a bad education by forcing you through to secondary school. I mean, let's not get fetishistic about completing school. We should be, is this child acquiring the life skills he will need to successfully function as an adult, as a father, as a mother, as a member of the community? And is the school providing that? And if they're dropping out because the school isn't providing that, fix the damn school. Don't blame the child.
Okay, I think that is a good point to finish. We've been at it almost 2 hours. It's almost 1 o'clock. Professor Lant, Pritchett, thank you so much for your excellent conference. There's a tremendous provocation for us. You had a lot of insights. We devoted the social panorama of Latin American and Caribbean last year to the issues of challenges of education, particularly after the education blackout of the COVID and so on, which made things worse, but things were not good before anyway, and this is an area where that a lot of concern for us. Actually, we had a meeting of all the ministers of education together with UNESCO and other UN organizations here in this room in January. I was thinking as you were delivering your talk that it would have been wonderful to have you giving this talk in front of all the ministers. So for next time, yeah, you already invited, I think. Thank you so much, and big round of applause. Please.
Thanks for having me. Yeah. Maybe I will get invited twice.
Yeah, I will. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you very much. And this time, I will not ask you to be waiting for the next conference of the 75th anniversary of ECLAC. So this is the last one. Thank you very much for all of you that are connected. But yes, we will have all these conferences in a book. Don't have the date of publication, but it will be later throughout this year with the 9 conferences. And I would like to remind you that there will be a special number of ECLAC's magazine by the end of this month, and it has highly interesting material related to all of the diagnostics of the gaps in Latin America and original thoughts on the how. And thank you very much. Thank you for being here and for being connected.
9.